I'm creating this video to go over briefly the questions from exam one. I think you might find that useful as you're preparing for future exams and also for going back over the exam so that you can learn from any mistakes that you may have made on the exam. So I'll do it relatively quickly. And if you want to follow up with me on any of the questions, you can come during office hours or make an appointment to speak with me. So let's begin. So question one is focused on, I should say, increasing budget deficits over the past few years in the US, which is true. And it says based on the uses of saving identity, that is, use the uses of saving identity, which is what? That is SP, private saving, plus government saving. We can go back to chapter 2 to really understand what's involved with that. And equals I, investment, right? Purchase of new capital by businesses, not financial investment, not stocks and bonds, but rather physical capital and software and buildings and things like that, plus the current account, which is our trade surplus. Saving by the government has to do with our budget surplus, if it's a positive, or deficit, if it is negative. So the idea here is that we're talking about government saving going down. That's what bigger budget deficits mean. And it says, why are federal budget deficits potentially bad for the economy in the long run? And how might they reduce future economic growth? That's the first thing. Well, the first thing to notice is that there's an equal sign, right? So if something goes down on the left, then if nothing else changes on the left side of the equal sign, then either I or CA have to go down to keep this equal, right? That's just a basic law from algebra. And so if I goes down, that means there's less investment, there's less new capital, and we know that capital is associated with the production function, right? If we have Y and N here, and if the level of capital goes down, then that causes the production function to shift downward. Or it maybe just doesn't grow doesn't shift up as fast. It's another way you can think about it. But that would, by itself, for a given level of N, right, for a given level of employment, would lead to lower GDP, potential GDP, than there otherwise would have been in the economy. So that's why bigger budget deficits are potentially bad for the economy. They could crowd out private investment in capital, which leads to slower growth in the economy. We could also use the growth accounting equation here to get at this as well if we wanted to. Okay, so the second part of that question says, what could keep this negative impact of increased budget deficits from happening? And describe two possibilities. All right, so if the only other two things in this equation is if instead of I going down, the current account went down. In other words, our trade deficit got even bigger negative number. Trade deficit would be a negative current account. And so if that happens, then I could stay the same. Lower government saving, bigger budget deficits could lead to bigger trade deficits. What that really means, if you go back to chapter 2, when we're talking about measuring the economy, is that foreign citizens are really buying our government debt, right? And therefore it doesn't affect interest rates as much and capital spending in the United States. The other thing that could happen is if private savers increased saving, consumers increased saving, then that could offset, in fact, let me just get rid of that, right? That could offset the lower government saving and not have any impact then on the right-hand side. So either an increase in private saving or a reduction in the current account could keep I from falling. It's really just based on the uses of saving identity, right? That's what we're talking about here. So, to what extent does your answer in part A depend on what the government's spending its budget on? Well, if we think about this, and it comes about from an increase in government spending, if they're using that spending for things like infrastructure, right, which is what we've heard about in the last year, Congress passed a big infrastructure bill, for example. And if that happened, right, that shifts the production function up and could offset any reduction in private investment in new capital, right? So that tends to offset, right, any negative effects from the private market. If the government spent money on sending checks to you and me for COVID, well, we're going to spend those checks, but it's not necessarily going to have anything to do with the production function. And so unless we're spending it on education, let's say, that might increase A, right? This is an increase in K, right? So it depends, yes, it does depend what the government spends its money on, whether those bigger budget deficits matter or not in the long run. An analogy would be you having an increased debt due to borrowing to come to college, but then you don't graduate and don't get the degree and don't get the benefit of the degree in terms of higher lifetime income. And so that would be a negative. But if you actually, so you get all the spending, you get the, let's say you're borrowing money, student loans, but you didn't get the degree, right? You get the bigger debt, but you don't have long-term growth to and long-term human capital to benefit from. On the other hand, if you're borrowing that money to come to college, you get a degree, and you get a better job and higher income for the rest of your life, well, then the borrowing's not so bad. So it depends what you spend your money on and how that plays out, right? When you borrow money. So that's question number one. Question number two, right, on the exam has to do with people's attitudes, workers' attitudes toward work, and whether they've shifted in the last couple of years or not. And the question is, so if there's a reduced willingness to work by a significant percentage of people, some suggestion that maybe that's happening, maybe it isn't, right? What kind of impacts does that have on the economy? If we use the production function and the labor market. So here's the production function. Here's the labor market, labor demand, labor supply, the real wage, level of employment, GDP. Here's equilibrium in the labor market, call it N0. Come on up, N0. That amount of labor can produce this amount of real GDP given current technology and given current capital stock, right? And here's the real wage in equilibrium to start with. Let's call that A. We'll call this A. Well, if it's the case that there's less willingness to work, that would be a leftward shift in the labor supply curve, right? So the equilibrium would go to point B, call it N1. Real wage goes up, less employment, and has a negative impact on GDP production or full potential GDP in that case. So that's the potential negative impact of that if that really happens, right? If that continues, right? That this long-term or this trend continues long-term, people saying, well, I'm not willing to work, you know, I want more work-life balance, or I just don't want to work as much. That's kind of impact it has on the economy. According to the growth accounting equation, what would be needed to offset that, right? That growth accounting equation is percent change in Y is the percent change in A plus 0.3, the percent change in K, plus 0.7, percent change in N. So we're saying is if this is going down, right, due to workers not wanting to work as much. Well, what could offset that? Well, either that has to go up or that has to go up to keep that going up rather than going down. But if productivity goes up, that's A, or if the amount of capital in the economy goes up, that's K. Either one of those things is going to shift the production function upward, right? And so even if there was less labor, right, and one, it's now more productive because there's more capital and technology and schooling to work with. And so even if that's the case, that where the amount of labor being supplied is going down, right, that would typically lead to a lower real GDP. An increase in K or A could cause GDP actually to rise. Right? So that's really question 2 on the exam. That's the idea with that equation. Right? Or sorry, with that question. So let's go to question number 3. 3 is the work by Lisa Cook, right, who's now on the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. Right, she's an HBCU graduate, PhD in economics, and now is one of the newest members on the Board of Governors making monetary policy for the US. So she published this paper that took her years to gather the data in Russia and other places, but in particular while she was there and doing some research. And then she was thinking about the ideas, I should say, around this while she was there, but then came back to the US and was working on this idea. Well, what about the impact of race riots, lynchings, etc., racial violence, more broadly, segregation laws included as well. After slavery, right, after emancipation, 1870 to 1940, and found that during periods of higher racial violence, during that period of time, that this had a negative impact on African American patent production. And in that paper, she has data that shows this in different graphs and tables, etc. The question here is, how can we relate that to our model, which is actually what she is really talking about in the paper. She doesn't have the graphs, but that is exactly what she's focused on. So it's a really intriguing, interesting use of economic theory and economic data, real world data, to make and some insights about the impact of, in this case, racial violence in the economy, on people in the economy and the economy overall. So if we use our model, right, with our production function, right, N and Y, and the labor market, right, labor demand, labor supply, whoops, the equilibrium real wage, the equilibrium level of employment, and 0. So with that amount of employment, here's the amount of output that can be produced at full employment. All right, follow the same process that we did in the last question. Oops, let's call that A. Just call both of these A. This is our starting point. The question is, what kind of impact, right, does her research about this have on in this model, or also the growth accounting equation, right? The percent change, again, the percent change in Y is equal to the percent change in A plus 0.3 times the percent change in K plus 0.7% change in N. Right? Both of these are related, right? N, K, and A are what underlie the production function But we can do it in equation form, we can do it in graphical form. So when we talk about in terms of her work and what I've given you in the preamble to the question, actually, right? If there is a lower level of inventive activity, fewer patents, right? Right, that is the claim, right? Fewer black patents during this time. What does that do? And that's related to inventiveness, right? To innovation, etc. Right? New technologies, new machines, etc. That's a reduction primarily in our production function. What kind of impact does that have? Well, it's a downward shift, right? In the production function. And if that happens, it also leads to, right, a lower slope here. This is the slope here, or lower slope. The marginal product of labor goes down. It's probably the case that fewer black inventors in the labor market during this period of time as well, and so labor supply may have gone down as well. That's possible. So the equilibrium is back here, and one. It's hard to tell what's going to happen to the real wage. It depends on which one of the shifts is larger. But with N1 being the employment level, then we're going to have less GDP. So what's the upshot of all this? The upshot of all this, right? We end up with B here, B here. We end up with less employment in the economy overall. We end up with less GDP than if there had not been this level of racial violence. And if we had had the patents that would have been generated had there not been this sort of racial violence that occurred in the US, right? And around the world in some places as well, but most, primarily in the US with what the data she's looking at, we would have higher levels of real GDP, right? Same thing if we use the growth accounting equation. Whoops, sorry. If we use the growth accounting equation, if this is oops, go back and recreate that part. Sorry about this. P, right? If this is going down, then this is going to go down unless one of these other things increases, right? Or assuming those, and this is going down according to our model as well. So, and probably the fewer patents, there's going to be less. That's not going to grow as fast either. So probably all three of those are going down, less GDP growth than if we didn't have this racial violence. All right. So the second part of the question says, how do the research findings support the claim reducing racial violence and discrimination is good for everyone? Well, and we're going to look at this later in the course again. So we're going to circle back to this idea, right? And so the idea here is that we'd be on the blue line. We'd be on the blue lines. If we didn't have that racial violence, we would have higher real GDP growth, not just for African Americans, but for everyone in the overall economy. Right? And so it's a very interesting research project, very interesting publication, research paper that's taking a very unique look at a particular historical period in the U.S., and we can relate that to our macroeconomic model directly. In fact, that's what she's doing. That's what she was doing. So using econometrics and other kinds of modeling techniques using the data, but basically that is the idea. Question number 4 on the exam is directly from one of our homework questions. Right? Again, we're going to use our model, And that is the key thing. If there's anything I can say, and I've said it on a number of people's exam papers, is use the model. The model here are the graphs and equations, but primarily the graphs. And so you've got to trust the graphs. The graphs, the models are tools. They're ways to discipline your thinking so that you're focused on the most important things. And then we can add other real life things back into that. But we don't want to start with that. We want to boil down sort of real life kinds of examples to what we know from our models. And then we can add other things back in and say, well, what if this was the case? Or what if this was the case? Well, then we can add that back into our models afterwards. All right. But if there's anything I want you to learn from the exam is please use the models. We're going to be doing this all semester long. Okay. So here is real GDP, here's the real wage, here's labor demand, labor supply. All right, this was the model that we had as of the exam. All right, this is constituted our macro model. Again, here's the equilibrium. We have to start by labeling everything. This amount of employment, you get this amount of real GDP. All right. You see that it sounds the same exact way as in questions 2, 3, and 4. Our starting point is exactly the same way, right? This is y equals a, that's k to the 0.3 and the 0.7. Right? And so the question is, well, some people are worried about industrial robots, other kinds of automation. They're going to actually reduce employment, all right? So let's analyze that. What do we think about that? What do we, now that you're learning about economics, what does that really mean? All right, well, that has to do automation and machine learning, that sort of thing, artificial intelligence, that has to do with increasing A. It might have to do with increasing K as well, because often new computers, new software, it's kind of combining both those ideas, embodying that in new capital, but it's a shift upward of the production function. That's the key point. When that happens, the slope of the production function gets bigger. The slope of that production function is the marginal product of labor, along with the profit maximizing idea that firms are maximizing profits. Then that increases labor demand. It's going to increase employment, the real wage, and potential GDP. So, I'm sure that should have been A back here. Starting point, right? So this is, right? So there's an increase in employment, right? The full employment level of employment. It's an increase in the real wage, right? Which increases living standards, right? As people can buy more stuff with their hours of work, higher wages, and an increase in potential GDP. This is like a win-win-win, all right? So increases in technology actually help or have the potential to help everyone in the economy, right? But not everyone wins from new technology, as we saw in our JIT examples, or our JIT readings, right? So who wins and who loses when new technologies are adopted in a country, and how can government policies reduce the social cost of those new technologies while maintaining the social and economic benefits? So how do we still have the kind of benefits that we see in our model here, but also reduce the social cost? In other words, in particular, who loses when automation happens and new technologies come about? Those with the skills to use the technologies are the ones who benefit. Those who don't have the skills and education levels to benefit from the new technology are the ones who may end up losing their jobs in that transition. Right? So, and if that has implications in terms of ethnicity and race and gender, well, then that's going to play out differently among different groups in the economy. So how can you help workers adapt to those new technologies, to take advantage of them, to be more productive, to be more hireable, to be more likely to benefit? Well, things like increasing training, increasing education levels, could be free education, increasing financial aid for students, right, through government policy. Those are the kinds of economic policies that can help workers, right, adjust and adapt to the changes. We're talking about the long run, so it might be across generations. Okay, but it's one of the reasons why we have college education. It's one of the really valuable things about an HBCU education, for example, and the reason that you're all here, and the reason that I'm here as well, is to help you get the skills. They're going to help you adapt to those new technologies, in this case, new automation techniques, etc. But they're only going to benefit the people that actually learn them and learn how to use them, right? And so our economic model can help us understand that and analyze that. Finally, question number 5. So question number 5 is using this equation, right? Per capita real GDP. I mean, I give you this. It can be written as K over N to the 0.3 capital per worker times N over population, which is the labor force participation rate. All right. So the first question is if we use this as a measure, Y over per capita GDP, output and GDP as a per person in the economy, right? Then why are some countries rich? Why are some countries poor? Well, it's intended to be a simple sort of warm-up question, actually. And so don't overthink it, right? So some countries are rich either because they have higher they have higher capital per worker, they got more technology, etc., more education, more capital per worker, or they have a greater fraction of their population that's working. It's not just a matter of a bigger population, right? That's just N, right? The fraction of the population is what matters. The bigger N to produce more stuff, but there are also more people to divide it among, right? And so if output per person, goods and services per person, then it's the fraction of the labor force that matters, right? Poorer countries have lower levels of these things, right? So why is A the key to increasing long-run living standards? Well, the simple answer to that comes straight from the equation, right? Right, straight from this equation. And that's what it says in the question. Why, according to this equation? Well, capital per worker has that 0.3, right, exponent. That means there are diminishing returns to that. It can increase, but ultimately there are limits to that. You can get so much capital per worker, and then you just don't get much of an increase from that anymore. And over the population, this is the labor force, right, or employment as a fraction of the population. The biggest that can be, right, is 1. Can't get any bigger than 1. Population can't be employment can't be any bigger than the population in the country, right? And so ultimately that is the key, A. Okay, again, what can government do to promote A? Right, kind of like in that last question, they can increase education, they can increase research funding, they can increase training, right? They can increase infrastructure and technology in the economy, right, through government spending and government programs, right? Could be funding the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health. It could be, providing free education, tax credits for people going to college. Could be increasing amount of money that are given to universities and HBCUs or other kinds of universities for that matter as well. Right? Those things can all have an impact on this. And then part C is, why is it that some countries, relatively poorer countries, catch up to richer countries and even surpass them in terms of living standards over long periods of time, like a century, right? While some other countries fall. Well, it has to do with how fast these things are growing in these economies, right? So the faster that these things are growing, A, capital per worker, or fraction of the labor of the population that's working, right, the country's going to grow faster, right? That's the left-hand side is going to grow faster. So the rule of 70, right? So if a country, if 70 divided by the growth rate, if it's 70 divided by 2, then as we've seen, takes 35 years for GDP per capita to double. The country's growing at 4%, then it's only going to take 17 and a half years for GDP per capita to double. If the economy is growing at 10%, it's only going to take 7 years for real GDP per capita to grow, right? So if we have output per worker or per person in the economy on the vertical axis, and we have a country in time 0 at the start here as a low level, right, of GDP per person. Another country has a higher level, right? But the higher country is not growing as fast. It's growing, right, over say 100 years, but it's not growing as fast as the poorer country. At some point, the poorer country is going to overtake that. The rule of 70 will give us some indication of how long that's going to take, right? And we can plot out, right, the path of the countries and how long it's going to grow, how long it takes for GDP per capita to double. And you can see that, right? Let's take the extreme one here, right? In 35 years, right, the GDP per capita might double in an economy that's growing at 2%. Let's say that's the rich economy. It's doubling every 7 years in the poorer country, let's say, that is growing faster at 7%. So in 7 years, this will have doubled, or in 35 years, let's say it that way, in 35 years, this will have doubled 7 times. Not 7 times bigger, doubling 7 times, where it's only doubled once in the richer country that is growing more slowly. Well, if that happens, eventually it's going to overtake it in some year right out here. And so that's the idea with question 5. Question 6, an extra credit question, is really meant to get you thinking about what have you been reading in the Wall Street Journal and how are you able to summarize that. So you really needed to be saying something about employment, what's been happening to employment, the labor force participation rate, the unemployment rate, what are the numbers shown over the last month or two? What about real GDP? What about spending, consumer spending? All right, especially consumer spending. All right, what's happened to interest rates? What about policy? What's been happening in terms of the Federal Reserve? All right, and it's not just some of those things, but you really need to put all those things together then to also say, well, what are the implications of that? Oh, not only now, but over the next few months. And if we add to that things like the war in Ukraine, right, with Russia, we add things like COVID into that. What's happening with COVID, right, here and in other countries? So what's the forecast? Right, what's happening at the Federal Reserve? They're raising interest rates, right, which is raising interest rates. Well, that makes it more expensive to borrow. We also have inflation. What's been happening to inflation? And so this question is really giving me an understanding of how keeping up with reading the Wall Street Journal and what's happening in the economy, in the U.S. economy, right? And to be as specific as possible about that. So I hope this helps you go back, look back through the exam 1, help you think about how you need to approach the future exams, how you can use homeworks, and how the homework assignments really get you prepared, in particular for exams. All right, I say that in the syllabus, but I think you'll see that here, and I think you will have seen that on the first exam generally. So I hope this is be useful to you as you go forward in the course.